in the grim darkness of the far future. There are warriors who do not fight for empire, nor for faith, but only for slaughter. They are the Eaters of Worlds. In the endless expanse of the galaxy, where stars are both womb and tomb, there existed a world whose soil was soaked with blood long before Angron's birth. It was a world where gladiators fought not for honor, but for survival, where the clash of blades and the roar of the crowd were the lullabies of the damned. It was here, in chains and misery, that Angron, one of the Emperor's 20 lost sons, first drew breath. Unlike his brothers, scattered by the dark hand of chaos, yet found upon worlds where they might rise as kings, conquerors, or prophets, Angron's cradle was the arena. He was not nurtured by scholars or warriors of noble creed, but by slavers who hammered iron into flesh and forced child and man alike to fight until death. Even as a child, his strength was beyond mortal limits. He was a giant among broken men, his blows shattering bones, his fury unmatched. Yet what set him apart was not only strength, but defiance. Angron did not simply fight to entertain the masters. He fought to resist them, to spit upon the cruelty of his fate. He became the rallying figure for countless other slaves, the one who would not bow, the one who cursed his captors even as blood ran down his chains. The crowd named him the Red Angel, though they knew not how prophetic that title would become. But the slavers were not content with his natural power. They carved into his skull a device of horror, an artifact from a darker science, the butcher's nails. The nails were no mere implants. They were a curse. They rewrote the very rhythms of his mind, feeding upon his thoughts, twisting them until only rage remained. Pain was his constant companion, a gnawing, ever-present torment. But in battle, in slaughter, the nails rewarded him with fleeting release. Each enemy slain was a moment's respite, each death a balm upon his tortured soul. Imagine, then, a child forced into the pits, his every thought screaming with agony unless he drowned it in blood. Angron's tragedy is that he never had a choice. Where his brothers were shaped by worlds that tested them, Angron was mutilated, forced to become a weapon against his own will. And yet in this torment, he found kinship. Among the gladiators, he discovered brothers and sisters of blood, not primarchs, not superhuman warriors, but men and women who shared his pain. He loved them with a desperate loyalty, the kinds born not of power, but of shared suffering. In their eyes, he was not a monster. What? He was a leader, a brother, the spark of hope that perhaps one day they could break their chains. The nails screamed in his mind, demanding more death, more slaughter. Yet Angron fought for something greater than release. He fought for freedom. The rebellion came as all chains eventually break. Angron and his fellow gladiators rose in a storm of steel and fury, slaying their masters, storming the cities of their oppressors. The world trembled as slaves became soldiers, driven by the wrath of their Red Angel. For the first time in his life, Angron tasted true defiance, not as a gladiator in the pit, but as a general of a rising army. And then, in the midst of this desperate war, he came, the Emperor of mankind, clad in golden light, surrounded by warriors whose armor gleamed like suns. The Emperor descended upon the battlefield. To Angron's soldiers, he was a god. But to Angron himself, he was a stranger, another master, another figure, who spoke of destiny. The Emperor offered him a place among his brothers, a role in the great crusade that would unite humanity. He spoke of purpose, of the chance to lead legions that would conquer the stars, not just the chains of one world. But Angron refused, for he would not abandon his gladiators, his true brothers and sisters. They had bled with him, starved with him, suffered the agony of the nails alongside him. How could he leave them to die while he ascended to glory? The Emperor gave no answer that would soothe him. And so, with the cold inevitability of a god imposing his will, the Emperor teleported Angron away, stolen from the battlefield, ripped from the arms of his people. When the Red Angel awoke, he was not among his brothers, but aboard the Emperor's ship, surrounded by the silence of betrayal. On the surface below, his gladiators fought and died, their rebellion crushed without their leader. Angron screamed, not in rage, alone, but in grief that would never heal. When Angron first set eyes upon the warriors created from his gene seed, he felt nothing but bitterness. They stood before him in perfect formation, thousands of giants clad in ceramite, their every motion disciplined, their voices united in praise for their father. They were the 12th Legion Astartes, engineered to embody his strength, his resilience, his fury. But to Angron, they were not brothers. Break. They had not suffered as he had, not bled in the pits with him, not endured the endless torment of the butcher's nails. What could these sterile creations know of the chains that had defined his life? He looked upon them and saw only hollow reflections. And yet, as the days passed, he recognized something familiar in their eyes, an emptiness, a hunger waiting to be filled. They were strong beyond measure, but directionless, like blades without an edge. It was then that Angron made his choice. If his sons could not share his past, then they would share his torment. The tech priests and apothecaries of the Legion were commanded, under threat of death, to replicate the cursed implants buried within his skull. The nails would be their inheritance. Many protested. Some begged him to reconsider, to see that his path would destroy them. But Angron was immovable. He did not see cruelty in his command. He saw kinship. To him, the butcher's nails were not only torment, but truth. They stripped away weakness, drowned out doubt, and left only rage, the one thing the galaxy could never extinguish. And so, one by one, the sons of the 12th Legion were carved apart, their minds torn and remade by the nails. They screamed as iron invaded flesh, their thoughts drowned in static, their hearts chained to fury. And when they rose, they were no longer the disciplined warriors the Emperor had forged. They were the eaters of worlds. From that moment, the 12th Legion was bound not by honor or duty, but by slaughter. They fought with a savagery that terrified even their brother legions. Where others conquered in the name of unity, the World Eaters butchered without restraint, leaving only fields of corpses and cities drowned in fire. The Emperor looked upon his son with sorrow, but did not intervene. Perhaps he thought time would heal Angron's rage. Perhaps he believed even the butcher Primarch could be turned to reason. But every campaign, every battlefield, every massacre only deepened the nail's grip. To fight was to live. To kill was to breathe. And the World Eaters, once soldiers of a dream, became an army of monsters, mirrors of their father's agony, driven by the same unquenchable hunger. And the World Eaters were its thunder. Where other legions brought compliance with banners and diplomacy, Angron's sons delivered only silence. Silence born from the annihilation of entire populations. At the Emperor's command, Angron led his legion into the void. They descended upon rebellious worlds, their drop pods screaming like meteors, their chainswords shrieking like predators let loose. And when the dust cleared, there was nothing left but butchered flesh and burning ruins. To the World Eaters, war was not a tool of conquest, it was a need. The nails demanded blood, demanded slaughter. Each battle was not a duty, but a release, a momentary escape from the agony gnawing within their skulls. And so they fought, with a desperation that unsettled their allies. Reports began to spread among the Imperium's armies. Where the Ultramarines left behind orderly worlds, the World Eaters left graveyards. Where the Imperial fists raised fortresses, the World Eaters raised mountains of the dead. And yet, none could deny their effectiveness. No enemy could withstand them for long. Resistance crumbled beneath the storm of their rage. The name Eaters of Worlds was not a title they claimed for themselves. It was given by terrified survivors. Whispers carried across systems, warnings etched in blood and smoke. Soon, even the loyal legions spoke the name in hushed tones, for it described more than their brutality. It was truth. The bond between Angron and his legion deepened in this crucible of slaughter. He stood at the forefront of every assault, drenched in gore, a god of war made flesh. His warriors followed him not out of loyalty to the Emperor, but out of love for their father, who had given them the nails and shared in their torment. In him they saw themselves. In them, he saw the only family that had not abandoned him. Yet this bond was a chain as much as it was a bond. The World Eaters could not exist without Angron's fury, and Angron could not escape the cycle of blood that consumed them all. Every victory only fed their addiction. Every massacre only pushed them further from the Imperium they were meant to serve. Other Primarchs began to voice their concerns. Guilliman condemned the needless waste of life. Dorn warned of the corruption born from unrestrained brutality. Even Horus, the War Master himself, saw danger in the path Angron carved. But no rebuke could tame the butcher. And in time, whispers in the warp began to echo louder. The gods of chaos watched with delight, for in the World Eaters they saw kindred spirits, warriors who lived only for the fury of battle, hearts already chained to endless carnage. All it would take was a spark, a single betrayal to set them ablaze forever. For now, the Imperium still called them brothers. For now, they still fought beneath the banner of the Emperor. But beneath the surface, the World Eaters were already lost. Their destiny was written in blood, and the galaxy would soon drown in it. The galaxy trembled when Horus, War Master of the Imperium, turned against his father. It began in whispers, carried on the tongues of corrupted priests and demonic entities. The seeds of betrayal had been sown in the blood-soaked soil of countless worlds, and now they bore bitter fruit. For Angron, the decision was never truly his. His hatred for the Emperor still burned from the day he was torn from his brothers and sisters on New Syria. The nails had broken his mind, turning every moment into torment. He fought not for the Imperium, but against the pain inside his skull. When Horus extended his hand, Angron grasped it, not out of loyalty, but because it promised freedom. Horus understood him. The War Master knew that Angron's rage could not be caged by oaths or duty, and so he offered a vision, a galaxy where war was endless, where bloodshed was worship, where the nails would no longer be a curse, but a gift. Angron listened. First time, someone did not seek to chain him, but to unleash him. At Istvan III, the betrayal revealed itself in fire. Brackets. The World Eaters, alongside the sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, and the Death Guard, turned their blades against those who remained loyal. Brother fought brother, legion against legion, as entire armies were purged in a storm of betrayal. The World Eaters reveled in the slaughter, their loyalty to the Imperium severed forever. Yet the true breaking point came at Istvan V. There, upon the black sands of that cursed world, Angron led his legion in open defiance against the Emperor. The Loyalists, who had survived the first massacre, marched with courage, believing they could still turn the tide. But when the trap was sprung, when Angron and his fellow traitor Primarchs descended upon them, the truth was laid bare. The Great Crusade was over. The age of betrayal had begun. The battle was a nightmare carved into eternity. Drop pods rained from the sky, disgorging warriors howling for blood. The ground shook beneath the titanic clash of brother against brother, chainsword against bolter, Primarch against Primarch, and above it all, Angron roared, his twin axes carving a red path through friend and foe alike. The Loyalists fought bravely, but they were drowned beneath the tide. Their cries of defiance were silenced by the thunder of artillery. Their banners, torn and burned amidst the carnage. One by one, the sons of the Emperor were cut down, not by strangers, but by the very brothers who had once sworn to protect them. When the smoke cleared, the sands of Istvan V were no longer black, but crimson. It was the grave of loyalty, the death of trust. And in its ashes, the World Eaters stood unshackled, their fate entwined with the dark gods who had watched with glee. Angron had crossed the threshold. No longer a reluctant son bound by chains. He was now the champion of rage incarnate. His legion, once feared as the Emperor's hounds, were now the blood god's chosen butchers. The butcher's nails no longer marked them as flawed. They marked them as destined. From this point, there was no return. The World Eaters had become what they were always meant to be, the devourers of hope, the heralds of slaughter. And as they marched beside Horus, the galaxy itself began to bleed. The sky above Terra burned. Bracket. For months, the heavens had been torn apart by void battles of impossible scale. The fleets of the traitor legions clashed against the remnants of the Imperial Armada, while the War Master's vast armada encircled the cradle of mankind. The stars themselves seemed to vanish, drowned in fire and smoke. And at the center of it all stood the Imperial Palace, an edifice of stone and faith, built to withstand eternity. Its walls, thicker than mountains, bristled with defenses, void shields, and countless armies sworn to protect the Emperor. For many, it was the last beacon of hope. For Angron and his World Eaters, it was nothing more than a fortress to be torn down. When the first gates fell, Terra shook with the fury of the assault. The Iron Warrior's siege engines tore through adamantium like parchment. The Death Guard spread their pestilence through shattered districts. The Emperor's children drowned whole wings of the palace in screams of excess. But it was the World Eaters who brought terror. The World Eaters did not march in disciplined ranks. They poured into the breaches like a red tide, their armor drenched in blood, their chain axes shrieking in frenzy. Every corridor became a slaughterhouse, every hall a charnel pit. Imperial fists, white scars, and the loyal remnants of shattered legions met them head-on, and for a time they held. But against the unending fury of Angron's sons, even the bravest defenders faltered. Angron himself was a storm of blood and steel. He smashed through bastions that had stood for millennia, his twin axes tearing apart custodians and Astartes alike. The defenders spoke of his roar, shaking the very walls, of his presence blotting out all hope. He was not merely a Primarch now. He was something more, a creature of the warp, his flesh and spirit twisted by the butcher's nails and the dark whispers of Khorne. The Emperor knew this battle could not last forever. Even as the palace burned, he remained upon the golden throne, sustaining the webway against demonic intrusion. But he watched as his sons, once united, tore each other apart on the very soil of Holy Terra. The siege dragged on, a grinding attrition of blood and despair. Millions died each day, their bodies piled high against the palace walls. The sound of bolters never ceased. The air grew thick with ash, screams, and the endless echo of chain blades tearing flesh. And in the midst of this apocalyptic struggle, Angron pressed ever forward. He seemed tireless, a beast driven by unending rage. Where other traitor Primarchs schemed or sought glory, Angron sought only blood. Every blow he struck was an act of defiance, a scream against the father who had abandoned him, a challenge hurled into the void itself. The defenders began to whisper his name like a curse. Not Horus, not Fulgrim, not Mortarion. It was Angron they feared most in the close-quarter slaughter, for he could not be stopped, could not be reasoned with. He was war made flesh. As the palace walls cracked, and the War Master prepared his final gambit, Angron and his legion carved a path through the defenders. The blood that ran through Terra's streets was their victory hymn. But in truth, Angron cared little for conquest. To him, the siege was not about thrones or crowns. It was about the kill. It was about feeding the nails, silencing their hunger for a fleeting moment. And yet, even amidst this frenzy, destiny had already written its end. For Angron's fury could shake the foundations of Terra, but it could not decide the duel that mattered most, the final confrontation between father and son, Emperor and War Master. The World Eaters had played their role. They had drowned the palace in blood, broken its walls, and shattered its defenders. But history would not remember them for victory. It would remember them for the slaughter. The siege of Terra was the crucible of the Imperium, and in its flames, Angron was revealed for what he had always been. Not a savior, not a leader, but a destroyer. A weapon unleashed, a beast of Khorne, the angel of rage who would forever be chained to the blood he spilled. The siege of Terra ended in silence. Not the silence of peace, but of exhaustion, of a galaxy broken by betrayal. The Emperor struck down his favored son, Horus, in a battle of myth and tragedy. Yet the price was eternity upon the golden throne. His body shattered, his will chained to the machine that would forever sustain humanity's fragile beacon. For the traitor legions, the War Master's death was not the end they had imagined. The cry of triumph they sought turned hollow, swallowed by the warp itself. The traitors scattered, broken not by the blades of their brothers, but by the failure of their rebellion. And none were more cursed in their retreat than the World Eaters. The World Eaters had bled the most. They had hurled themselves into the firestorm of Terra, heedless of losses, consumed by rage until they were scarcely more than rabid beasts. When the order to retreat came, many did not hear it, or refused to. They fought until their bodies collapsed, until the Loyalists cut them down, until they drowned beneath their own fury. Those who survived were dragged back by their brothers, snarling, broken, hungry for battles that no longer existed. Angron himself was wrenched away from the walls of the palace by the will of dark powers. He did not leave willingly. He had wanted to die there in the blood of Terra, screaming his defiance at his father until his throat was torn raw. But the Chaos Gods had other plans. They had marked him long ago, when the nails first chewed into his soul. To them, Angron was too valuable a weapon to be discarded. And so he was pulled into the Eye of Terror, dragged into the Immaterium by the currents of damnation. The Imperium hailed it as a victory. The World Eaters had been cast into exile, their Primarch swallowed by the warp. Yet in truth it was no victory at all. For within the Eye, Angron's transformation was completed. The nails, once a torment, became his gospel. The whispers of Khorne drowned out all else. The Butcher Primarch was remade as a daemon prince of the Blood God, his mortal flesh fused with the essence of eternal rage. His legion followed. The World Eaters, broken and leaderless, found themselves adrift. But Angron's shadow loomed large. They carved their path into the Eye, slaughtering imperial worlds as they fled, their chain axes forever screaming. And there, in the madness of the warp, they tore themselves apart. The discipline that once bound them as the Emperor's 8th Legion crumbled. All that remained was blood, violence, and the hunt for war everlasting. For 10,000 years, the Imperium told itself that the rebellion had ended, that Horus had fallen, and the Emperor had triumphed. But the World Eaters proved otherwise. They became the reminder that chaos does not end. It festers, it grows, it feeds upon every drop of blood spilled in the galaxy. Every massacre they wrought was another lie exposed, another truth revealed, that the heresy had never truly ended. /. Angron rose again and again, a red titan of rage, bursting from the warp to lead his sons in wars of slaughter, entire sectors drowned in blood at his command. Imperial scribes called them Black Crusades, incursions, or damnations. But the truth was simpler. They were the hunger of Angron unleashed, the eternal echo of a Primarch who had been denied his death at Terra. And so the galaxy endured 10,000 years of lies and silence. The Imperium painted itself in the colors of victory, crowned the Emperor a god, and taught its children that the traitors were beaten. But in the shadows of the Eye, the Butcher Primarch roared, and his legion sharpened their chain axes for the wars yet to come. There would be no peace, not for the World Eaters, not for the Imperium, not while Angron's fury echoed across the stars. The Great Crusade was the age of conquest when the Emperor unleashed his sons and their legions upon the galaxy. World after world bent the knee or burned in defiance. The stars rang with the thunder of bolters and the roars of Astartes. It was an age of glory, but also of blood. Among all the Emperor's legions, one earned a reputation unlike any other. They were not the most numerous, nor the most refined, nor the most obedient, but they were the most feared. They were the XIII Legion, the Warhounds reborn as the World Eaters. Where others advanced with careful strategy, the World Eaters charged headlong. Where others relied on artillery and precision, they preferred the brutal press of close combat. Chain axes screaming, they became the hammer of the crusade, smashing through the walls of resistance, breaking defenses with sheer savagery. They were the shock troops, the first wave, the embodiment of war in its rawest form. Imperial commanders learned quickly, when a world resisted stubbornly, send in the World Eaters. When an enemy fortress refused to break, unleash Angron's sons. They would not only take the objective, they would drown it in blood so thoroughly that no one would ever think of resisting again. The Vox recordings of those years carry echoes of battlefields where the World Eaters fought. The static is filled with their war cries, their chain axes tearing through armor and bone. The screams of billions silenced beneath the tide of red. To fight alongside them was to witness the very storm of battle given form. To fight against them was to know terror beyond words. And leading them was Angron, the Butcher Primarch. His presence made the Legion unstoppable. He was a whirlwind of steel and fury, hurling himself into the thickest fighting, carving apart warlords, beasts, and entire armies with his twin axes. The World Eaters mirrored him, each battle becoming a reflection of their father's rage. It was said that wherever the World Eaters fought, the soil itself turned red. Whole continents became wastelands. Cities were left in ruins. Their populations annihilated. The Imperium called it compliance. The survivors called it slaughter. The Great Crusade was not fought by one legion alone. Each Primarch, each brother, brought his own methods of war. Some built empires of logic and order. Some sought glory in strategy and precision. And then there were the World Eaters. To many legions, they were both an asset and a curse. The sons of Guilliman, the Ultramarines, looked upon them with disdain. Guilliman believed in building civilizations, in crafting lasting empires where compliance meant more than conquest. But wherever the World Eaters went, little remained. They left behind ashes where cities should stand, bones where workers should live. To Guilliman, they were not conquerors, they were butchers. Rogel Dorn and the Imperial Fists regarded them with wary respect. Dorn understood fortification, siege, the art of patience. The World Eaters shattered such works not with cleverness, but with sheer brutality. Even Dorn admitted, when the enemy's walls must fall, Angron's sons could be the perfect storm. But he also warned that such a storm could not be controlled forever. The Blood Angels, led by Sanguinius, saw in them a reflection of their own curse. The red thirst whispered in the hearts of Sanguinius's sons, pulling them toward the same savagery. When they watched the World Eaters in battle, they glimpsed a mirror of what they themselves might become if the darkness within them was ever unleashed. It was not hatred that filled Sanguinius's eyes when he looked at Angron, but sorrow. And Horus, the favored son, the war master-to-be, he alone saw their worth in full. He called them brothers without hesitation, praised their ferocity, and unleashed them where the fighting was thickest. To Horus, they were the legion he could always rely upon to break this enemy, no matter the cost. It was Horus who shielded them from criticism, who whispered to Angron that his fury was not a flaw, but a gift. Yet not even Horus's favor could erase the truth. Among the legions, the World Eaters became a name both feared and whispered. On the battlefield, their allies gave them a wide berth. Commanders avoided placing them in prolonged garrisons, for they had no patience for peace. They lived only for war, only for the red haze of slaughter. There are records of compliance where the World Eaters' allies refused to fight beside them. They would march at the same time, yes, but at a distance. For when Angron's sons charged, they cared little for lines of battle, for friend or foe alike. The red mist blinded them. And when the killing frenzy took hold, sometimes it was imperial soldiers who fell beneath their axes. But the Emperor allowed it. Perhaps he thought their savagery could be contained. Perhaps he believed Angron's rage could be tempered with time. Or perhaps he saw them simply as a weapon, brutal, but necessary. In the Great Crusade, every tool had its purpose. Thus, the World Eaters carved their legacy in fire and blood. Feared by their enemies, feared by their allies, feared even by themselves. There are worlds whose names are now dust. Worlds that once thrived with cities, markets, temples, and children playing in sunlit streets. But when the World Eaters descended, nothing remained. They were unleashed where resistance was fiercest, where the enemy refused compliance to the Emperor's will. And each time, they drowned those worlds in oceans of blood. The world of Genna resisted the Great Crusade with fanatic defiance. Its armies fought with zealotry, erecting great citadels, and swearing never to bow to the Imperium. Most commanders might have sought to break them with sieges, diplomacy, or displays of strength. But Angron would have none of it. He led his sons in a storm of drop pods that blackened the sky. As they fell, the surface of Genna shook like thunder. When the pods split open, the butcher's nails screamed in the skulls of the legionaries. The World Eaters charged, chain axes howling, and the defenders of Genna crumbled. No quarter was given. No prisoners were taken. When at last the citadels fell, the World Eaters did not stop. Entire districts were razed, population centers set aflame. In a single week, Genna ceased to exist, not as a world of culture, but as a charnel pit for the World Eaters' fury. The pattern repeated. Wherever they went, compliance was swift, but at a price. Where Guilliman's ultramarines built lasting societies, where Dorn's imperial fists left fortresses, where the White Scars rode free winds of conquest, the World Eaters left ashes. Entire planets were forced into silence, not because they accepted imperial truth, but because there was nothing left to resist. Historians of the Ordo Historicus, long after the heresy, would whisper that the World Eaters never brought compliance. They brought extinction. One of the darkest tales was Carthay, a verdant world, rich in life. Its leaders refused to kneel before the Emperor. They believed their gods would protect them, that their warriors would withstand the storm. But Angron came. For 3 days, Carthay burned. On the 4th, the seas boiled with the blood of the fallen. When the World Eaters finally departed, the world itself was silent. No voices. No prayers. Only skulls, stacked high as monuments to Angron's rage. Imperial record-keepers tried to erase the atrocity. The planet was marked simply as compliant. But the survivors, those few who escaped into the void, spoke a different word: exterminated. And so the legend of the World Eaters grew, not merely among enemies, but within the Imperium itself. Allies watched them descend upon worlds with unease. Imperial citizens whispered that to be liberated by the World Eaters was worse than death. Even the Mechanicum, who respected power above all, looked upon the Legion with suspicion. For power without restraint was nothing more than destruction. But the truth was darker still. The World Eaters were not only driven by their own rage, they were slaves to the nails. The cursed implants in their skulls that drove them to constant fury. When they killed, the nails sang. When they slaughtered, the nails gave them release. But when they were idle, when peace stretched too long, the nails screamed. This was why worlds burned. It was not only conquest, it was survival. To Angron's sons, killing was the only silence they ever knew. Thus the Great Crusade marched onward, with the World Eaters at its bloody tip. Where they struck, resistance shattered. Where they lingered, civilizations died. And in their wake, the dream of a peaceful Imperium grew darker. They were the Emperor's war dogs, and though many hated them, many feared them, all knew they were necessary. For when no other legion could break the foe, the World Eaters would. Utterly, absolutely, and without mercy, was unlike any of his brothers. Where Guilliman dreamed of empire, where Dorn sought fortresses, where Sanguinius inspired loyalty with angelic grace, Angron was born into slavery. When the Emperor found him, Angron was not a ruler of worlds, nor a builder of nations. He was a gladiator, a chained beast, scarred and broken from a lifetime of endless war. And in his skull burned the butcher's nails, xenotech implants that screamed for blood, tearing apart thought, memory, and peace until only rage remained. The Emperor, in his cold logic, saw use in Angron's fury. But Angron saw only betrayal. For when the Emperor arrived, he did not free Angron's enslaved brothers-in-arms. He did not fight beside them in their doomed rebellion. Instead, he teleported Angron away, leaving those warriors to die on the sands of Nuceria. From that moment, Angron's heart was poisoned. The chains of his gladiator past never left him. And though he now commanded a legion, though millions hailed him as a demigod of war, Angron remained a slave. This time, not to Nuceria, but to the Imperium itself. The Emperor did not seek to heal Angron. He did not remove the nails, though with all his unmatched power, perhaps he could have. Instead, he left Angron broken and weaponized. To the Emperor, Angron was a blade, crude, brutal, but effective. And so, the World Eaters followed their master's curse. Where the nails had once destroyed one man, they now infected an entire legion. The apothecaries of the 12th Legion began implanting the butcher's nails into their Astartes. At first, only a few received them, those who could endure the agony. But soon, it became doctrine. To be a World Eater was to bleed, to rage, to obey the nails. The Legion's identity was transformed. They were no longer strategists, builders, or conquerors. They were berserkers. Their war cry was not for honor, nor glory, nor even the emperor, but for the silence that came only when the nails were fed. This transformation did not go unnoticed. The other Primarchs looked upon Angron with sorrow or contempt. Horus, ever the diplomat, sought to comfort him, calling him brother, and treating him as an equal, despite his savagery. But Guilliman despised the butchery, seeing it as a betrayal of the dream of the Imperium. Dorn mistrusted Angron, for he saw no discipline in the 12th Legion, only madness barely chained. Even Sanguinius, whose compassion was boundless, struggled to look upon Angron without pity. The worst wound of all came from the Emperor himself. Where others were praised for their triumphs, Angron received only silence. Where others were celebrated as visionaries, Angron was scorned as a liability. The Emperor did not love him. The Emperor only used him. And Angron knew it. For the World Eaters, the Butchers, nails were both gift and curse. They amplified aggression, granting bursts of speed and strength that turned a warrior into a storm of steel. But they also eroded the mind, stripping away reason, strategy, and even memory. Veterans of the Legion often forgot their victories. They forgot their comrades' names. Some could no longer speak, their minds reduced to snarls and screams. Each battle made them stronger and weaker. Each slaughter won them glory and cost them fragments of their souls. What Angron had endured as a single gladiator, now tens of thousands of Space Marines endured as a legion. An army of broken warriors, each one chained to their own agony, each one seeking release through killing. As the Great Crusade continued, Angron's hatred deepened. He did not care for the Emperor's dream. He did not care for the Lectitio Divinitatis, the Mechanicum's treaties, or Guilliman's bureaucratic visions of empire. All he saw was hypocrisy. The Emperor spoke of unity, yet left his sons broken. The Emperor spoke of freedom, yet chained him again. The Emperor spoke of love, yet gave him none. To Angron, the Imperium was not salvation. It was another cage. And though he fought in its wars, though he slew in its name, Angron dreamed only of escape. From the nails, from the Imperium, from the Emperor himself. It was in this bitterness that Horus found fertile ground. Horus understood Angron's pain, or at least claimed to. He spoke to him as a brother, not as a commander. Where the Emperor offered commands, Horus offered sympathy. Where the Imperium gave Angron chains, Horus promised freedom. The seed was planted long before the heresy. For Angron's loyalty to the Imperium was never born of love. It was born of necessity, of being given no choice. But loyalty to Horus? That could be something more, something personal. And so, the tragedy of the world. Eaters deepened. They were warriors without peace, bound to a Primarch without hope, serving an emperor without mercy. It was only a matter of time before their fury, their bitterness, and their brokenness found a new master. The Great Crusade blazed on, with the World Eaters carving their legacy into the galaxy in blood and ruin. But beneath the victories, beneath the oceans of corpses, there was only tragedy. For the 12th Legion was not truly a legion of warriors. It was a legion of slaves. Slaves to the nails, slaves to their rage, slaves to a destiny that would lead them, screaming, into the arms of chaos. The World Eaters had always been unpredictable, but as the Great Crusade stretched on, the cracks within the XII Legion widened into fractures. Reports from Imperial Command spoke of excessive collateral damage. Worlds meant to be brought into compliance were instead annihilated. Civilizations that might have surrendered were butchered into silence. Where Guilliman's Ultramarines built empires of order, the World Eaters left only wastelands soaked in blood. Imperial commanders began to avoid deploying them in delicate campaigns. Instead, they were unleashed as hammers of destruction, sent into the thickest fighting where their brutality could be excused as necessity. But even this had a cost. For each battle fought, the nails screamed louder. For each victory, the World Eaters became less a legion of soldiers and more a tide of berserkers. And Angron, their Primarch, grew ever more distant from his brothers and from the Emperor. The Emperor's dream of the Imperium was one of civilization, of enlightenment and unity. Angron despised it. He mocked Guilliman's bureaucracy. He laughed at Dorne's fortresses. He spat on Lorgar's faith and dismissed Vulcan's compassion. What mattered to Angron was the fight, the spilling of blood, the crushing of chains, the silence of the nails when battle reached its crescendo. In his eyes, the Imperium was a fragile illusion. It was built by dreamers who did not understand the truth, that life was suffering, that freedom was a lie, that the galaxy could only be ruled by violence. This philosophy bled into his sons. The World Eaters began to see compliance not as liberation, but as conquest. They did not bring worlds into the Emperor's light. They drowned them in darkness. The distrust among Angron's brothers deepened. Guilliman argued for censure. He demanded that the World Eaters be restricted, or even disbanded, before their savagery poisoned the Crusade. Dorne, ever the pragmatist, cautioned restraint, but admitted the truth. Angron was a liability. Sanguinius, with sorrow, begged the Emperor to help his broken son, but the Emperor remained silent. Some whispered that the Emperor had already abandoned Angron, that he had accepted the World Eaters as a doomed legion, one that would burn brightly and then fade into ash. Others whispered that he simply did not care. But Horus listened. Horus saw opportunity. Where the Emperor ignored, Horus embraced. He invited Angron to fight beside him in the most brutal campaigns. He praised his strength. He celebrated his victories, even when they were drenched in massacre. To the World Eaters, Horus seemed a true brother, a leader who understood them. Where the Emperor saw madness, Horus saw loyalty. Where the Emperor saw a curse, Horus saw power. And Angron, bitter and broken, began to trust him. Whispers began to follow the World Eaters. Strange rituals performed in the aftermath of battles. Sigils carved into flesh. Shrines built not to the Emperor, but to something older, darker. The Inquisition would later uncover fragments of these truths. But at the time, they were dismissed as rumors, as exaggerations. The truth was far more sinister. The nails, the rage, the blood, they had already aligned the World Eaters with powers beyond the Imperium. Every slaughter was an offering. Every scream was a hymn. Every river of gore was a prayer answered. The World Eaters were not yet servants of chaos, but they were already its children. By the time the Crusade neared its end, the fate of the World Eaters was sealed. Their reputation was in ruins. Their Primarch despised the Imperium. Their loyalty lay not with the Emperor, but with Horus. And when the moment came, when Horus declared his rebellion, there was no hesitation. The 12th Legion, the Eaters of Worlds, did not need persuasion. They were already lost. The galaxy had not yet seen the true depth of their madness. But it would. At Istvan, at Terra, everywhere their howls echoed. The Imperium would bleed. Thus ended the World Eaters' role in the Great Crusade, not as noble warriors, not as builders of a better tomorrow, but as broken gladiators, chained to their rage, heralds of the blood-soaked age to come. The seeds of betrayal that had been planted long before now blossomed into a poisonous flower. Horus, newly wounded and remade by the whispers of chaos, reached out to those brothers who shared his disdain for the Emperor. Among them, none seemed more suited to his cause than Angron, the Red Angel. For Angron had never felt loyalty to the Imperium, never found kinship with the ideals of civilization, never shared the Emperor's dream of unity. His loyalty was only to battle, to the silence of the nails when blood was spilled. Horus knew this, and Horus exploited it. He spoke to Angron not as a father might, but as a fellow son of war. He offered him understanding where the Emperor had offered chains. He praised his fury where others had condemned it. He whispered that the Emperor had betrayed them all, that the master they bled for was no more than a tyrant hiding his secrets. In Horus's words, Angron found the validation he had long craved. The bitterness that had gnawed at him since his first meeting with the Emperor erupted into outright hatred. And so the World Eaters, already broken, already half-mad, tipped fully into rebellion. When the heresy broke into open war, the World Eaters followed Horus with unflinching loyalty. There was no hesitation, no division within their ranks. The nails sang with joy at the promise of endless slaughter. The legion that had once fought for humanity now turned its fury upon their brothers. For them, betrayal was not a crisis of faith, it was liberation. The first great test of their loyalty came at Istvan V. The loyalist legions, believing they had the traitors cornered, deployed in force. They thought themselves united, a shield against corruption. But on that cursed world, the trap was sprung, not by the loyalists, but by Horus himself. The World Eaters, alongside the Emperor's children, Death Guard, and others who had turned, revealed their true allegiance. The massacre that followed was unlike anything the Imperium had ever witnessed. As the Loyalists fought valiantly, believing their brothers still stood beside them, the traitor legions turned their blades inward. The World Eaters roared with unchained madness as they fell upon their unsuspecting allies. There was no discipline, no careful strike. The World Eaters tore through friend and foe alike, their chain axes screaming, their bolters thundering, their howls rising above the clash of war. They gave no thought to tactics, no recognition of loyalty or kinship. To them, all were enemies, all were prey. The nails demanded blood, and blood they gave in rivers. At Istvan, Guilliman's sons burned. The salamanders were hunted like animals. The iron hands were shattered. Loyalist Primarchs watched in horror as those they had once called brothers butchered them without mercy. And always at the forefront were the World Eaters, drenched in gore, their Primarch leading them with unrelenting fury. Angron himself cut through the battlefield like a storm given flesh. No line could hold him, no bastion could withstand his wrath. His gladiatorial past was reborn in full. Each duel, a dance of slaughter. Each swing of his axes, a chorus of screams. The Emperor's dream of unity died on Istvan's scorched soil, drowned beneath the blood spilled by his own sons. To the World Eaters, this was not tragedy. This was transcendence. They no longer pretended to be builders of an imperium. They were destroyers, devourers of worlds, and in betrayal, they found their truest selves. And yet, within the hearts of their loyalist brothers, something broke forever. Trust, once absolute, was shattered into dust. The legions that survived bore scars that would never heal. They would never again look upon the World Eaters as brothers. They would see only beasts, enslaved to their rage, reveling in a betrayal so profound it defied reason. The massacre of Istvan V echoed through the galaxy. It was a warning, a revelation, and a promise. The World Eaters had chosen their path. They would not turn back. They would not repent. Their destiny was sealed in blood. But the heresy was far from over. Istvan was only the beginning. For with each battle that followed, the World Eaters sank deeper into madness. Their loyalty to Horus forged in slaughter. Their bond to chaos sealed with every drop of blood spilled. The massacre at Istvan V was not merely a betrayal of arms. It was a betrayal of the very idea of brotherhood. The legions had once been a family, bound by blood and oath, united in the Emperor's dream of conquest and unity. That dream lay broken in the ash. The World Eaters, shoulder to shoulder with the other traitor legions, carved apart those who had trusted them, and in doing so, they cast away all remnants of loyalty. The killing fields of Istvan were oceans of fire and gore. Loyalist lines, already locked in brutal combat with Horus's vanguard, were suddenly struck from behind by the very warriors they thought stood as allies. The sound was deafening, bolter fire from both sides, the whine of chain blades, the scream of brothers dying in disbelief. Amid the chaos, the World Eaters howled like beasts, finally set free from their cages. They no longer fought in formations. They no longer heeded orders. They fought as frenzied individuals, driven by the nails and the ecstasy of slaughter. Entire companies were butchered in minutes, their warriors torn apart by men they had once shared victories with. To a loyalist space marine, the sight was incomprehensible. A brother in ceramite armor, bearing the same sigils, the same oaths, suddenly turning axe against friend without hesitation. The World Eaters took no pleasure in betrayal. It was not joy they sought. It was release. The nails demanded silence, and silence came only with the spilling of blood. Each swing of a chain axe dulled the fire in their skulls for a moment. Each kill quieted the screaming in their heads. In that grim calculus, friend and foe were meaningless. Only blood mattered. Angron strode through the battlefield like a force of nature. His warriors followed in his wake, emboldened by his example. Where Angron walked, loyalist lines collapsed. His rage was palpable, a psychic storm that fed his sons' madness. They became echoes of his fury, extensions of his endless war. The loyalist Primarchs, who had survived the initial ambush, Ferrus Manus, Vulcan, and Corvus Corax, were thrown into disarray. Ferrus Manus, in his defiance, sought out Fulgrim, not yet knowing his brother had long since fallen. The duel that followed ended in tragedy, Ferrus beheaded by Fulgrim's blade. This single act of kinslaying broke the last remnants of trust across the battlefield. If a Primarch could murder his own brother, then what hope remained for their legions? For the World Eaters, this was vindication. They had never trusted the illusion of unity, never believed in a father who chained them to ideals they did not share. Now the lie was gone. The battlefield was honest. Blood was truth. Rage was freedom. Reports from survivors describe scenes of horror beyond imagining. Marines torn limb from limb, their armor split apart under the raw strength of chain axes. Loyalists begging their brothers to stop, crying out names, invoking oaths of loyalty, only to be silenced by blades. The ground of Istvan was soaked in crimson, a charnel pit that stretched for miles. Even the warp itself seemed to howl in ecstasy, for each death fed the hunger of darker powers watching beyond the veil. Horus had promised victory, and he had delivered it through betrayal. The Loyalists were annihilated, their survivors scattered and broken. Guilliman's empire of Ultramar burned in silence as his sons fell in heaps of corpses. Vulcan was captured, subjected to torments unending. Korax fled with what remained of his Raven Guard, his soul scarred by the massacre. The dream of the Emperor was bleeding out, one legion at a time. Yet it was the World Eaters who left the deepest scar. Their participation at Istvan proved that they were no longer a legion of men, but beasts in armor. They had shed the last vestiges of discipline, the last pretense of brotherhood. They were berserkers, devourers of all, and their reputation from that day forward was sealed in horror. Among imperial records, one phrase became attached to them in whispers: the Eaters of Worlds. They did not merely conquer, they consumed. They left nothing living behind. And even as the massacre ended, even as Horus consolidated his victory and set his eyes upon Terra, the World Eaters found themselves changed. The nails screamed louder, demanding more. The silence after battle did not last as long. The hunger within them deepened. And though they did not yet know the names of the gods whispering to them, the truth was undeniable. They had become the chosen of blood. The betrayal of Istvan was the beginning of their true fall. No longer bound to the Imperium, no longer restrained by brotherhood. They had found their calling in the embrace of carnage. Angron had led them into damnation, and they followed him willingly. For in damnation, they found their purpose. The Horus Heresy would spread across the galaxy. But for the World Eaters, its path had already been written. Every battlefield would be another Istvan. Every foe, another brother to be slaughtered. And in the end, they would stand as the crimson tide that drowned the Emperor's dream forever. Istvan had ended, but its echoes carried far across the galaxy. The World Eaters, drenched in gore and madness, did not stop with betrayal. Their chain axes were hungry for more, and Horus knew well how to unleash them. Wherever he sent them, worlds burned, cities were reduced to rubble, and the screams of the dying filled the warp. They had become his spear of terror, the embodiment of rage and blood. On every campaign that followed, the same grim pattern emerged. The World Eaters were unleashed as shock troops, hurled into the thickest of fighting, where their fury would break loyalist lines and shatter morale. Entire planetary populations were slaughtered, not because it was necessary for victory, but because the nails demanded it. Their Primarch did not restrain them. He urged them on. Angron himself led by example, throwing himself into battle with no thought for strategy, only for slaughter. The worlds they liberated under Horus's banner were drenched in horror. civilians were not spared. Cities became charnel pits, their streets running with rivers of blood. Reports tell of entire hives silenced in a single night, their millions slaughtered as world eaters rampaged unchecked. To Horus, it was a tool. The brutality of the world eaters spread fear faster than any message could. To Angron, it was freedom. Every kill another answer to the unending pain of the nails. But even within their own ranks, cracks began to show. Once the world eaters had at least carried the semblance of a legion, warriors bound by loyalty and martial pride. Now they were little more than mobs of berserkers. Discipline evaporated. Cohesion collapsed. They followed only Angron's roar and the burning hunger inside their skulls. Commanders who tried to impose order were ignored or killed. The World Eaters were no longer soldiers. They were predators. Other traitor legions, though allied, looked upon them with both awe and dread. The sons of Horus respected their fury, but despised their lack of control. The Death Guard saw them as useful hounds, unleashed where attrition alone would not suffice. Fulgrim's Emperor's children mocked their crude brutality, but secretly envied the purity of their rage. Only the word-bearers seemed to understand them, whispering dark sermons that fanned their bloodlust further, pointing them ever closer toward the gods of the warp. The loyalist Primarchs, scattered and desperate, soon came to recognize the World Eaters as one of the greatest threats in the war. Wherever Angron appeared, defenses crumbled, not because of superior tactics, but because of sheer, overwhelming slaughter. His presence on a battlefield was like a storm of fire. Entire chapters of loyalists were butchered simply because they had the misfortune of standing before him. One campaign stands etched in blood, the assault on Nuceria, Angron's homeworld. It was here, amidst the ruins of his past, that Angron abandoned the last vestiges of humanity he still clung to. Horus brought him there to break the chains of old wounds, but instead, it deepened Angron's hatred for the Emperor. Seeing the world that had enslaved him, and realizing the Emperor had never saved him from that torment, Angron's rage boiled over. The World Eaters followed their Primarch into absolute carnage, massacring the planet until nothing remained but ashes and skulls. By this time, whispers of the warp had become shouts. Khorne, the blood god, took notice of the endless rivers of blood spilled in his name. Even if the World Eaters did not yet recognize him, the nails sang louder with each slaughter, and their hunger became insatiable. Though Horus commanded them, though Angron led them, in truth, they had already begun to serve another master. The heresy raged on, and the World Eaters left their mark on every battlefield. Loyalist fleets fled before them, for to face them was to face annihilation. They did not fight for victory. They fought because they could not stop. Every moment away from battle was torment. Every hour without killing was agony. The nails drove them forward, and blood was their only relief. In the years leading up to Terra, their savagery became legend. Loyalist refugees told tales of entire planets silenced in days, their populations butchered by warriors who wore red and white armor, screaming like madmen as they tore through civilians and soldiers alike. Some worlds resisted fiercely, but resistance only prolonged the suffering. The World Eaters would not relent until there was nothing left to kill. When Horus finally turned his gaze upon Terra, it was clear that the World Eaters would be among the vanguard. They had become the perfect weapon for the final assault, not disciplined, not strategic, but devastatingly destructive. They were a tide of blood, and Horus would unleash them upon the Emperor's palace itself. But even before that climactic siege, it was evident to all who beheld them. The World Eaters were lost. They were no longer the 12th Legion of the Emperor. They were no longer brothers, no longer sons of the Imperium. They were berserkers, slaves to rage, heralds of slaughter. And as the Horus Heresy drew closer to its inevitable end, the question was no longer whether they could be saved, but how many more would be consumed by their fury before their story was finished. The whispers became screams. The hunger became law. By the time the ashes of Istvan had cooled, the World Eaters were no longer merely Horus's shock troops. They were the heralds of something darker, something older than mankind itself. At first, it came in dreams. Warriors awoke from the void sleep, drenched in sweat, hands trembling as if clutching phantom axes. Visions plagued them, skulls stacked high upon altars of brass, rivers of blood flowing into an endless abyss, a throne of bone where a shadowed figure sat in silence. They told no one, yet each man dreamed the same. Soon, the dreams bled into waking life. A chant began to echo through their ranks. Simple, primal, blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. No officer commanded it, no herald decreed it. It rose unbidden from thousands of throats, a tide of worship that none could deny. Horus tolerated it. For now, the War Master knew he could not leash Angron's sons with discipline. He could only aim them like a weapon and hope they struck where he desired. But even he sensed the shift. The World Eaters were no longer his legion alone. They were becoming Khorne's Angron, embraced it with savage joy. The butcher's nails in his skull throbbed with every battle. Yet when the chants rose, the pain dulled, replaced with rapture. He tore through enemies not as a commander, but as an avatar of slaughter. Where his axe fell, the warp itself shivered. Demons clawed at the edges of reality. Drawn by the storm of carnage he unleashed. There are records, fragmentary, scattered, of one such battle. A loyalist world, fortified with walls of steel and faith, resisted the traitors for weeks. The imperial fists held the bastions, unyielding as stone. Then Angron came. The ground cracked beneath his charge. The defenders fired until their barrels melted, but still he advanced, drenched in blood, roaring praises to no one but war itself. When the walls fell, the massacre was absolute. No prisoners, no survivors. When the smoke cleared, demonic sigils burned into the earth itself, etched by rivers of blood. Cinematic pause. Picture the battlefield. The air thick with smoke and iron. The earth trembling beneath the weight of marching warriors. And in the center, Angron, drenched in gore, his chain axes howling, his eyes lit not with rage alone, but with something greater. Devotion. Not to father, not to brother, not to Imperium nor War Master, to the god of endless war. For the loyalist Primarchs, each report was another wound. Dorn, unyielding in defense, cursed his brothers. Name, Guilliman, architect of order, saw in Angron the very undoing of civilization. Even Sanguinius, the angelic son, wept in silence for the brother he once admired. But no plea could reach Angron. No chain could bind him, save the ones he welcomed, the chains of Khorne. The Legion followed. Captains once known for discipline threw aside strategy for slaughter. Entire companies split into warbands, each competing for the highest piles of skulls. Blood rituals became routine. Helmets were discarded so warriors could feel the spray of gore on their faces. Their ships, once vessels of conquest, became floating arenas of death. On some, warriors fought each other in ceaseless duels, spilling blood simply to keep the nails at bay. And through it all, Khorne watched. Each act of violence, each sacrifice, each scream carried through the warp, feeding his throne of skulls. The World Eaters became his chosen, his instruments, his reapers of death. They no longer needed Horus's rebellion to justify their war. They had found their purpose. Yet still, Horus clung to them. He needed their fury for Terra, for the final siege, for the last battle that would decide the fate of mankind. And so he endured their madness, even as it spiraled beyond his control. The galaxy burned, the World Eaters marched, and in their wake, only silence remained. The heresy had ended, but there was no victory in it, only ruin. The galaxy smoldered with the ashes of brotherhood, and the Emperor sat broken upon his golden throne. For the Loyalists, it was survival. For the traitors, it was retreat. The legions that had cast their lot with Horus scattered into the void, hounded by vengeance and despair. Yet for the World Eaters, there was no reflection, no mourning, no shame. They were not defeated, because they no longer measured life in victory or defeat. They measured it only in blood. When the sons of Horus limped into the Eye of Terror, they carried their father's corpse and the burden of failure. The Death Guard carried their plagues. The Emperor's children carried their excess. But the World Eaters carried only rage. Rage that had never been quenched. Rage that could never be silenced. Their ships, battered and dripping with gore, drifted not to rebuild, but to seek their next slaughter. Discipline, what little remained of it during the heresy, collapsed entirely. The chain of command that once bound the 12th Legion into something resembling a military force shattered beyond repair. Captains were torn apart by their own warriors for daring to give orders. Sergeants were ignored, their voices drowned beneath the pounding roar of chain axes and the screams of the dying. What had once been a legion was now 1,000 warbands, each led by whichever berserker proved strongest in that moment. They had become predators rather than soldiers, packs instead of cohorts, not a legion, but a plague of blood-mad warriors unleashed across the stars. Even Angron himself was losing what little control he had ever held. The nails carved into his skull burned day and night, an agony so constant that even the strength of a Primarch could not resist it. His temper grew shorter, his sanity thinner. Once he had been capable of at least some command, some direction, though always through the language of violence. But now, in the aftermath of defeat, the torment consumed him utterly. Angron no longer led his legion. He rampaged at their head, a storm of blades and fury that the World Eaters followed blindly. The warp took notice. It had always whispered, even during the Crusade, even before Istvan. But now the whispers became a roar. The endless bloodshed, the slaughter without purpose, the rivers of gore spilled not for conquest, but for slaughter itself. All of it called to something ancient, something hungry. Khorne, the blood god, the Lord of Skulls, watched the 12th Legion with delight. They were his before they ever knew his name. Every scream, every broken skull, every river of blood was an offering to him. And so the bond grew. Warbands of World Eaters began to daub their armor with the mark of the Eightfold Path. Altars of skulls were raised in the ashes of ruined cities. Some whispered his name in frenzy. Others howled his praises as they charged. To them, Khorne was not a god to be worshipped, but a reflection of what they already were. They had always been slaves to rage. Now they knew the master of that rage. But the true transformation came not with the Legion, but with Angron himself. His body, already wrecked by the brutal grafting of the nails and scarred by centuries of slaughter, began to twist under the gaze of the warp. Horns burst from his brow. His flesh swelled. His bones split. His armor fused with brass and iron. His roar shook the stars, and his shadow grew monstrous. Angron had ascended. He was no longer a Primarch. He was a Daemon Prince, the favored son of Khorne, a being of wrath incarnate. In that moment, the last ties to the Imperium were cut. Whatever fragments of loyalty had once lingered, whatever glimmers of their origin as the Emperor's warriors had remained, were obliterated. The 12 Legion ceased to exist. In their place stood the Butcher's Hounds, bound forever to the Blood God. From that day, their wars had no purpose but slaughter. When the World Eaters descended upon a planet, it was not to claim territory or enforce dominion. It was to butcher, to burn, to drown entire populations in blood. Their campaigns ended not with treaties or occupation, but with silence. No survivors, no cities, only skulls piled high, rivers of gore flowing into the warp. Other traitor legions began to avoid them. The Black Legion found them uncontrollable, a liability more than an ally. The Death Guard tolerated them only when attrition alone could not break a foe. The Emperor's children mocked them as crude savages, but envied their purity of devotion. Only the Word-bearers, ever the priests of the Dark Gods, embraced them fully, for they recognized what the World Eaters had become. They were not soldiers. They were a sermon of slaughter, a hymn of blood in the name of Khorne. And yet, for all their terror, for all their infamy, they were slaves, not free warriors, not sons of the Emperor, not even champions of Horus. They were chained more tightly than ever before. The nails screamed inside their skulls, demanding violence. Khorne demanded skulls for his throne and blood for his rivers. Angron demanded only that his sons follow him into madness. And so they obeyed, because there was no other choice. To live without slaughter was agony. To kill was the only relief. 10,000 years passed, and the World Eaters never changed. They fought at Scalafrax, where their own legion tore itself apart in civil war. They fought in the Eye of Terror, raiding, killing, burning, never building anything, never holding any ground. They fought wherever their ships took them. Each warband a storm of carnage, unleashed upon an unsuspecting galaxy. To the Imperium, they became not an enemy to be defeated, but a curse to be endured. Worlds would vanish, their populations butchered in days, their hives reduced to charnel pits. Refugees spoke of warriors in red and white armor, roaring like beasts as they cut down anything in their path. Some said they were daemons. Others swore they were men who had long since surrendered their humanity. The truth was worse. They were both. And so the World Eaters became eternal, not in glory, not in empire, but in slaughter. They were the echo of Horus's rebellion, carried across 10,000 years of blood. They were Angron's children, but also his curse. They were the blood gods chosen, the slaves of rage, the heralds of annihilation. Wherever they went, one truth followed. There is no victory against the World Eaters. There is only survival, for as long as the nails allow. The ascension of Angron had marked a turning point, not just for him, but for all who bore the red and white of the World Eaters. In the wake of his transformation, the Legion fractured further, scattering into warbands that prowled the galaxy like wolves gone feral. No commander could hope to bind them. No vision of empire or dominion could restrain their rage. They were bound only by blood, by the nails that tore at their minds, and by the ever-hungry call of Khorne. In the years immediately following the siege of Terra, the Eye of Terror became their sanctuary and their prison. Within its warped, shifting stars, the World Eaters carved bloody paths from Daemon World to Daemon World, fighting each other as often as they fought outsiders. For them, war was not a means, it was the end itself. There was no rebuilding, no consolidation, no order. They thrived in chaos because it mirrored what they had become. It was here that Scalathrax unfolded, a tragedy not only for the Imperium, but for the World Eaters themselves. They had turned upon their own brothers countless times in frenzied bloodlust. But Scalathrax was different. It was the night the Legion ceased to exist in any form but myth. On that cursed ice world, the World Eaters clashed not with loyalists, but with the Emperor's children, their erstwhile allies in treachery. The battle was apocalyptic. Frost-bound wastes set aflame by orbital bombardments. Frozen seas cracked beneath the thunder of titans. Skies painted with burning ships that fell like meteors. In the midst of this maelstrom, the World Eaters fought with their usual savagery, chain axes roaring as they hacked through Fulgrim's sons. Yet as the battle raged, discipline, already fragile, shattered completely. Warbands turned on warband. Brothers tore each other apart. The nails screamed for violence, and there were no enemies left but themselves. By dawn, the ground was heaped with the corpses of not only the Emperor's children, but of the World Eaters as well. There was no victor, only ruin. Khorne the Betrayer, once captain of the 8th Company, cemented his infamy here. In his frenzy, he slaughtered friend and foe alike, earning a name that would echo for millennia. From Scalathrax onward, there was no Legion. There were only warbands, each a bloody shard of what the 12th had once been. No command structure, no Primarch to bind them, no shared cause. Only Angron remained as a figurehead, but his transformation into daemonhood carried him far from his sons. He appeared to them rarely, descending upon battlefields like a storm of brass and fire, leaving only devastation in his wake. To fight under Angron's gaze was both a blessing and a curse, glorious but certain death. The Imperium took grim solace in this fracturing. For though the World Eaters remained among the most feared of the traitor legions, their disunity made them less of a strategic threat. They could not coordinate great campaigns, could not conquer and hold. They could only destroy. But that destruction was so absolute, so thorough, that even the most disciplined of Imperial commanders trembled at the thought of facing them. In time, the galaxy learned what it meant when the World Eaters descended upon a world. There would be no surrender, for they took no prisoners. There would be no negotiation, for they did not speak. There would be no occupation, for they left nothing behind. They descended like a plague, their drop pods falling like meteors, their war cries shattering the night. Cities became arenas, streets became rivers of blood. Civilians were slaughtered alongside soldiers, their skulls piled in heaps, their blood offered as tribute to Khorne. The Imperium scribes recorded their raids as though they were natural disasters, for that is how they appeared. Sudden, unstoppable, and utterly destructive. A hive world might fall silent overnight, its billions butchered, its factories stilled, its communications cut off. When Imperial forces arrived weeks later, they found only charnel fields and the echo of chain axes in the wind. Among the traitor legions, their reputations solidified. The Black Legion, striving for unity and empire under Abaddon, used them sparingly, as one might unleash a pack of rabid hounds. They were useful for terror strikes, for breaking defenses, for sowing chaos in the midst of a carefully orchestrated assault. But to rely on them for anything more was folly. They were uncontrollable, and Abaddon knew it. The Death Guard, more patient, more methodical, considered them crude but effective. Nurgle's followers waged wars of attrition, grinding their foes down through plagues and despair. But when the enemy needed to be broken quickly, when morale had to be shattered in a single night, the World Eaters were called. The Emperor's children regarded them with disdain, mocking their brutality as artless. Yet even they could not deny the awe that came from watching Angron's sons carve through entire armies in hours. The word-bearers, ever the preachers, welcomed them most, for in the frenzy of the World Eaters, they saw the purest hymn to chaos, the most primal form of worship. But for the Imperium, their name was a curse. To hear whispers that the World Eaters were coming was enough to send worlds into panic. Governors fled, defenses crumbled, armies deserted. Entire sectors petitioned for aid before the World Eaters even arrived. So great was their terror. And when they came, the fear was always justified. For Angron's sons no longer fought as men, nor even as Astartes. They fought as slaves to Khorne, driven not by strategy, not by loyalty, but by the singular, inescapable demand: blood. Every kill was an offering, every scream a prayer, every skull a gift to the throne of their god. And as their numbers dwindled, consumed by endless slaughter, the survivors only grew more dangerous, more unhinged, more devoted. The galaxy had endured them for 10,000 years, and still their legend did not fade. It grew. For every world they destroyed, every massacre they wrought, the Imperium remembered. And in that remembrance, fear was kept alive. And so the World Eaters endured, not as conquerors, not as builders, but as executioners eternal. Their Primarch had damned them. Their god had enslaved them, and their own madness had consumed them. Yet still, they roamed the stars, chain axes in hand, skulls in tow, their war cries echoing across eternity. Blood for the blood god, skulls for the daemonhood, was not a liberation, but a damnation. In the warp, his form grew vast and terrible, horns like jagged towers, wings like torn banners of flesh, and a body forged in brass and blood. He was no longer a son of the Emperor, no longer a Primarch of flesh and bone. He was a war god's champion incarnate, a creature of infinite rage and unending slaughter. His very presence warped reality, tearing the veil between worlds with each step. Where Angron walked, the materium bled into the immaterium, and the sky itself wept fire. To the World Eaters, Their father's transformation was both a blessing and a curse. Few ever beheld him directly. His appearances were rare, unpredictable, and catastrophic. When he descended upon a battlefield, his sons howled with ecstasy, for to fight in his shadow was the highest honor. But such battles always ended the same. Oceans of corpses, worlds burned hollow, and warbands annihilated in the crossfire of his fury. Angron cared little for survival. His followers were nothing more than fuel for the great pyre of blood he built in Khorne's name. The Imperium, however, came to dread these manifestations as signs of apocalypse. Whole crusades were abandoned when astropaths screamed of Angron's coming. He was not merely a warlord, but a calamity, a living wound upon reality. His rage was not strategic, not controlled. It was elemental. Even the greatest imperial heroes faltered before him. For to face Angron was to face despair itself, the knowledge that no matter how hard one fought, the tide of blood would never cease. One of the most infamous examples came during the First War for Armageddon, when Angron led the World Eaters into the heart of that beleaguered world. The sky split with crimson fire. His legions poured forth in an endless tide, their chain axes carving through the defenders of the Imperium like wheat before the scythe. It took the intervention of the Grey Knights, the Emperor's most secret sons, to banish Angron back into the warp. That though the demonic Primarch was cast down, the scars he left upon Armageddon and upon the galaxy could never be erased. After Scalathrax, the World Eaters never again knew unity. They splintered into hundreds of warbands, each carving its own bloody path through the stars. Some swore undying fealty to Angron, seeking his presence in battle as pilgrims of slaughter. Others roamed as independent packs of killers, answering only to the hunger in their skulls. The nails bound them all, driving them to endless war, their minds incapable of peace, their bodies addicted to killing. Even in the eye of terror, where time twisted and reality bent, they fought without pause, against demons, against allies, against themselves. Their warbands became infamous across the Imperium. The butcher's nails made every World Eater a weapon of unrelenting violence. Whole regiments of Astra Militarum were butchered before they could fire a single shot. Planetary governors took their own lives upon hearing of a World Eater's fleet inbound, unwilling to witness what fate awaited them. Even the Adeptus Astartes, proud and unyielding, learned to fear them. For where other traitor legions might at least parley, the World Eaters did not. They spoke only in blood. And yet, even in their brokenness, the World Eaters were united in worship. They had become the perfect children of Khorne. Every act of violence, every skull claimed, every life extinguished was a prayer. They did not need churches, sermons, or scriptures. Their worship was written in gore and etched into the bones of the fallen. Khorne required nothing more. As the centuries bled into millennia, the Imperium could never destroy them. For how does one destroy a storm? Warbands scattered to the farthest reaches, raiding, pillaging, burning, only to vanish back into the warp. They left nothing to conquer, no empire to dismantle, only ruins, only death. And so they endured, eternal predators, as much a part of the galaxy as the stars themselves. In the dark age of the 41st millennium, when the galaxy once more burned under the light of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the World Eaters rose again to prominence. The Great Rift was not a curse to them, but a gift, a wound in reality through which Angron could stride more freely, and through which their endless raids could spread farther than ever before. Across both sides of the rift, from the darkest depths of the Eye of Terror to the heart of the Imperium Nihilus, the red and white of the World Eaters became a symbol of inevitable death. When Angron manifested anew in the galaxy's darkest hour, even his fellow Daemon Primarchs recoiled. His rage had only deepened in the warp, his form more monstrous than ever. He no longer appeared as a leader of men, but as a living avatar of Khorne's wrath, his every movement heralded by storms of brass, his every roar shattering mountains. Under his gaze, the World Eaters no longer resembled even broken Astartes. They became little more than extensions of his rage, berserk tides of flesh and steel. The Imperium, weakened and divided, could only fight to survive his rampages. The Grey Knights and the Sisters of Battle prayed in vain to hold him back, while entire chapters of Space Marines were ground beneath his heel. Wherever Angron appeared, the war was not measured in victories or defeats, but in survival. If a single fortress still stood, if a single population center endured, it was counted as a triumph. And yet, despite all this, the World Eaters found no peace. There was no solace in victory, no comfort in slaughter. Each massacre scraped at whatever remained of their souls, until nothing but raw hunger held them together. Flesh healed, armor was reforged, new chains of command rose and fell like corpses in a tide. But the pain inside the skulls, the nails' ceaseless grind, was eternal. They could not sleep without dreams of tearing, could not eat without thinking of the spilling of blood. Even in moments of quiet, which were rarer than comets, the world seemed to whisper of its own ruin and demand that they answer with violence. Angron's demonic ascension had not granted them unity. It magnified their curse. When the Primarch crossed back into the Materium, it was like a comet striking the sea. Whole weather systems tore apart, geomantic lines convulsed, fauna and flora shriveled under his shadow. His appearances were not merely battles, they were cataclysms. To see him was to know the end of a world before the first blade met bone. His armor sang of brass and blood, his voice shattered stone. Yet these visitations were rare, as if Angron himself were more tempest than man, drawn outward in periodic storms that left behind new legends of ruin. There were, however, patterns amid the madness. Certain warbands began to crystallize distinct identities, not through discipline, but through taste. Some warbands, those who called themselves the Crimson Maw or the Iron Maw in whispered threats, preferred frontal onslaughts, charging into fortified choke points until the earth itself clogged with bone. Others practiced sacrificial hunts, raiding ritual worlds to take living offerings for Khorne, dragging screaming populations to pyres that burned nights into dawns. A few strangest bands turned their fury inward and became wandering purifiers, hunting traitors and daemons alike, if only for the novelty of blood spilled on unfamiliar flesh. The other powers of chaos learned to negotiate their presence as one negotiates a storm, with distance, offerings, or denials when possible. The word-bearers would invoke blood litanies to direct a World Eater's surge at a favored target. The Black Legion would unleash a warband as a tactical hammer, then pull back when the bloodied tide threatened to consume their plans. Even the Death Guard, sloggers of corruption and attrition, used World Eaters as berserker fodder to break gates the slow burn could not. Yet alliances were transactional and ephemeral. A warband could turn without warning. Brothers spilled brothers over slights no sane general would call a crime, and those slights birthed new feuds that lasted centuries. Angron, for his part, seemed to value spectacle over strategy. When he did commit his presence, it was to prove a point about supremacy, about offering, about the inevitability of ruin. He would stride through orbital defenses as through grass, tear titans from their foundations, and flay banners into new, bloody standards. After one such descent on a fortress world, its name sung in curses by survivors, Angron ascended into the sky, his form melting into rust-red clouds, leaving behind not conquest, but an altar of skulls so vast that it drew cults for generations. Those cults offered their own sacrifice routes, and the cycle wound on. Imperial responses hardened into rituals of their own. Entire fleets would shadow a suspected World Eater's trajectory, hoping to intercept or divert them into empty systems. The Inquisition maintained dossiers, thick with names and warband sigils. Governors learned to evacuate by rote. The orders for mass firestorms and scorched earth policies often released before a single shot was fired. The Adeptus Astartes, when committed, fought with a grimness matched only by their foes' ferocity. Chapters that crossed paths with World Eaters bore scars that lasted centuries. Battle honors awash with the bitter truth that not every fight brought glory. Some only bought a reprieve. Among the galaxy's legends, a handful of encounters rose to near mythic status. The Grey Knights, secret and terrible, were credited with forcing Angron back on more than one occasion. Their victories were Pyrrhic. To bind or banish a daemon Primarch required blood, lives, and terrible rites whose costs echoed across sectors. Even when they struck true, the collateral ruin was immeasurable. Armies were shattered, entire continents hollowed out to host the rituals, and psychers screamed with the names of the damned. There were whispers, true or not, that the Grey Knights sometimes carried into the warp talismans born from the bones of angels and men alike. Tokens used but never spoken of. Whatever the truth, each banishment was a victory with a price. In the wider feeder, the Great Rift, Cicatrix Maledictum, changed everything. For a fractured, dying galaxy, the rift was a wound that bled opportunity. It slashed the Imperium's ability to coordinate defenses, and it widened the avenues through which warp-born threats could spill into the Materium. For the World Eaters, it was a gift. The rift let Angron's influence leak more freely. The fabric of reality at its edges had the texture of a battlefield. Warbands poured through the rifts into worlds that had once been safe, bringing with them the stench of death and the thunder of chain axes. New slaughter grounds opened in places where the Imperium's watch was thin or fractured, and the World Eaters made those places their own. And yet, even the rift could not grant them purpose. Their ubiquity grew, their horror multiplied. But they remained what they always had been, instruments of worship. Khorne reaped skulls. Khorne's appetite was bottomless. The World Eaters were both devout and condemned. Their religion simplified their identity to a single axis, kill. And that single axis both sustained and destroyed them. There were no doctrines beyond the act. There was no future beyond the next strike. Over the millennia, the Imperium learned grim lessons, tactics to blunt their assaults, cultist patterns to watch for, astropathic keys to detect the red signature of a raid. But learning did not equal victory. The World Eaters adapted in unpredicted ways. They took to void-boarding in shambles that made orbital defense nearly meaningless. They used psychic bait to lure defenders into webbed traps, and some bands even co-opted native religious fervors, turning local cults into sacrificial congregations. They were monstrous, and their ingenuity and violence made them more terrifying, not less. The final irony of their damnation was simple. Long after the Emperor's name had become a liturgy for some, and a whispered curse for others, the World Eaters remained chained to the moment before their fall. Their identity had ossified around rage. Every act was a repetition of the first sin, every victory a rehearsal of the same pattern. They had become a living parable. What happens when warriors are stripped of purpose and given only hunger? They were effective agents of ruin, yes, but they were predictable in their unpredictability, a storm that always returned to the same center. As the chapter closed, their shadow stretched into the present day, where ships of the Imperium still floated and planet forts still scraped the sky. Folk told one tale more than any other, the tale of red armor in the night, of chain axes singing their awful tune, of skull piles gleaming under a pale sun. Those stories bore warnings for governors and consolations for survivors. The legend of the World Eaters was eternal, as sure as the hammering of the butcher's nails in a trader's mind. In the 41st millennium, where stars themselves could be bought and sold and lost, the World Eaters endured, less as a military force than as an inevitability. And that inevitability, Angron's rage given shape, Khorne's hunger made manifest, was the legacy that would lead into the next chapter of the story, not of politics or strategy, but of survival and remembrance. For the Imperium did not only fight them with bolter and blade, it fought them in memory, in ritual, in law. It cast them as the warning carved into histories, the price of letting fury swallow reason. The World Eaters would not end the story, but they would define much of what followed. A galaxy that would look to its past wounds and try, desperately and imperfectly, to stitch them closed. 10,000 years have passed since the fall of Angron and his legion into the embrace of Khorne. 10,000 years in which empires have risen and collapsed, in which the Imperium itself has fractured and bled. And yet, across all this time, one truth has remained unchanged. The World Eaters endure. They are not a legion in the old sense. They are no longer bound by a chain of command, nor by banners, nor by ideals. They are shards of a shattered blade, scattered through the galaxy, and yet every shard still cuts. No fortress houses their council. No planet serves as their homeworld. The Eaters of Worlds are rootless, drifting upon tides of blood and chance. Yet wherever they appear, history records the same fate: ruin without measure. The passing centuries have not dulled their rage. The butcher's nails, buried within their skulls, still drive them to madness with every waking hour. Each beat of the nails demands violence. Each silence between battles is an agony greater than any wound. And so they slaughter without purpose, not to conquer, not to rule, but to appease the hunger within their own minds. Other traitor legions have forged identities in damnation. The Black Legion pursues power. The Word-bearers seek to spread their dark scripture. The Death Guard revel in decay, the Emperor's children in excess. But the World Eaters? They seek nothing but the spilling of blood. It is said that for every warband of the 12th, there is a trail of dead systems. Planets once vibrant with life are left as husks. Civilizations that had endured for centuries vanish within days of contact. In archives of the Imperium, entire star clusters bear the same annotation: Exterminatus by presence of the World Eaters. The cruelty lies not in the speed of their attacks, but in the fact that they never stay. They burn, they butcher, they howl, and then they vanish. They do not raise citadels upon the corpses they create. They do not plant crops in the ashes of their victims. They do not even garrison what they have conquered. There is no strategy. There is no grand design. Only the eternal repetition of slaughter. And so the Imperium has come to fear them in a manner unlike any other foe. Tyranids devour biomass to feed their hive fleets. Orcs fight to grow stronger, to prepare for greater wars. Chaos legions often carve dominions or pursue wars of vengeance. But the World Eaters, they bring death for its own sake. There is no defense against such an enemy, for they can be neither bribed, nor reasoned with, nor outlasted. Legends abound of the warnings that precede them. In one system, the sky was said to turn crimson for 7 days before the first World Eater fleet arrived. In another, the shrieks of butchers' nails were heard in the dreams of the astropaths, driving them mad before the first drop pod fell. On the shrine world of Valarn, the rivers boiled with blood long before Angron himself appeared upon the horizon, his laughter tearing the hearts from every living soul. These omens became a kind of prophecy whispered across the Imperium. The Adeptus Ministorum declared them signs of divine punishment. The Inquisition called them heralds of chaos corruption. But among the common people, the saying was far simpler: where the World Eaters tread, no world survives. And so it has been across 10,000 years of nightmare. Across the millennia, the galaxy has been scarred by countless battles, but among them, certain wars stand apart. Not for their strategy, nor for their political consequences, but for the sheer scale of their bloodshed. These are the wars remembered not in records alone, but in screams that echo through time. These are the massacres of the World Eaters. The first. Among them is the Scalathrax Massacre. Once, long after the heresy, the 12th Legion still bore some remnants of unity. World Eater fought beside World Eater, the memory of Angron binding them as brothers even in madness. But upon Scalathrax, that fragile bond shattered. It began as a campaign of annihilation against the Emperor's children. The air itself burned with the excess of Slaanesh. The ground trembled with the fury of Khorne. Chainswords clashed against whips of demon silk. Berserkers tore apart Sonic warriors, their blood sizzling on the frozen ground. Yet the true enemy was not the foe, but the cold. The planet's night was endless, its chill absolute. World Eater turned upon World Eater in desperation for shelter. When their brother would not share a fire, they took his skull instead. By dawn, the Legion was no more. No Primarch was needed to destroy them, only their own fury. From Scalathrax onward, they ceased to be a legion. They became warbands, broken shards of rage. And that fracture has never healed. Another legend tells of the culling of Bot. Bot was a forge world enslaved to the Imperium, heavy with manufactoria and chains. When the World Eaters descended, they did not seek conquest of the forges. They sought only skulls. The defenders fought with courage, Skitarii legions, titanic war machines, and the iron resolve of the Mechanicus. But courage is no shield against berserk fury. The berserkers rampaged through the forge halls, tearing apart engines of war with their bare hands. Great titans fell beneath chain axes. Forges burned until their metal rivers became molten oceans. The skies blackened with smoke. The ground split with fire. When the slaughter ended, Bot was no longer a forge world. It was a grave, and in the silence afterward, nothing remained to rebuild it. There are darker tales still. The Red Feast of Genna Prime. A shrine world devoted to the Emperor's light, filled with pilgrims and priests. It had no armies, no fleets, only faith. The World Eaters tore that faith apart in a single night. They stormed the cathedrals, their laughter echoing louder than the bells. Altars were overturned, reliquaries shattered, saint statues toppled into oceans of gore. The faithful were not simply slain. They were butchered in ritual heaps, their skulls piled high to honor Khorne. When dawn rose, the once holy world was a charnel pit, its hymns drowned forever in silence. Even among the enemies of the Imperium, the legends persist. The Eldar remember the slaughter at Leathar's gate. It was not a war, but an extermination. World Eaters poured into the Maiden World like wolves into a pen. For every soul that fled into the webway, 10 more were hacked apart before the portals. The psychic wails of the dying shook the very skein of fate. Even the Farseers wept, for they had foreseen the end but could not prevent it. The Orcs tell crude stories of the Battle of Vorgonth, where green tide met red rage. For once, it was not the World Eaters who stood as predators, but the Orcs. They came in numbers uncountable, their wog shaking the stars. And yet the butchers fought with such frenzy that even the Orcs faltered. The battle raged for 7 nights, the ground buried beneath corpses until the soil itself vanished. When at last the Orcs withdrew, it was not from defeat, but from awe. They named the World Eaters Da Red Butches, and to this day Orc warbands seek them out not for conquest, but for the joy of slaughter shared. But perhaps the most feared stories are those of Angron himself. When the Daemon Primarch manifests, the galaxy trembles. Entire sectors are sealed off, Imperial fleets abandoned to warp storms, worlds evacuated in blind terror. No defense can withstand him, for he is not a general, nor even a warrior. He is slaughter made flesh. On Nuceria, where he had once been a slave, he returned in daemon form. The skies burned red, the mountains split with his roar. Every living thing upon the world, beast, man, or machine, was slain. Nuceria was not merely destroyed, it was erased. The world itself cracked, a scar upon the galaxy that bleeds still in warp light. And yet, despite these countless massacres, the World Eaters have no record of them. They keep no chronicles. They carve no names in stone. It is the Imperium, their prey, that remembers. It is the survivors who tell the tales, their voices trembling as they whisper the same refrain. Where the World Eaters tread, no world survives. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is a graveyard. The Great Rift has torn reality asunder, splitting the Imperium in half, drowning 1,000,000 worlds in war and madness. And among the horrors that stalk the stars, one name inspires terror like no other. Angron, Daemon Primarch, slave of Nuceria. Lord of the World Eaters, the Red Angel. His presence is not a mere appearance, it is a cataclysm. When Angron emerges from the warp, the fabric of reality bends. Skies split into rivers of blood. Stars weep crimson light. Astropaths scream until their eyes burst, their minds burned out by the echo of his fury. For the Imperium, the first sign of Angron's coming is always the same: silence. Astropathic choirs fall mute. Warp storms surge across the void. Then the silence breaks, not with words, but with roars. Roars that reverberate across Vox networks, across entire fleets, across the souls of those who hear them. The slaughter begins before the first drop pod lands. On the shrine world of Ardath, billions of pilgrims had gathered to celebrate a millennium of the Emperor's light. The faithful filled its streets, its temples, its oceans of golden statues. Then Angron came. His war cry shattered the bells of the High Basilica. His army of berserkers descended in a rain of fire. The massacre lasted 3 days and 3 nights. When it ended, no living being remained. The statues lay cracked. The basilicas toppled. The oceans of Ardath boiled red. The ecclesiarchy struck Ardath's name from the records, declaring it a cursed world, forever denied remembrance. In the Rift Wars, Angron led warbands into the heart of Imperial space. The defenders deployed Titan legions, hoping to hold back his tide with god machines. But against Angron, even Titans are prey. Eyewitnesses describe him leaping upon a warlord Titan, tearing its head free with his bare hands, drinking in the explosion as if it were incense to Khorne. Entire battle groups dissolved before his fury. Planets burned, their ashes feeding the warp storms that followed in his wake. The banishing at Midgardia remains one of the Imperium's most desperate victories. The Grey Knights, those secret guardians of humanity, answered the call. They did not come to win a war, but to survive an exorcism. For weeks they bled, their psychic wards burning away their own souls to bind Angron. In the end, they forced him back into the warp, but the cost was ruin. The Grey Knights chapter lost an entire brotherhood. Midgardia itself was scoured, its people sacrificed in ritual flames to anchor the wards. Even in victory, the Imperium mourned. Yet Angron's banishment is never permanent. Like a storm, he always returns. He cannot be slain, only delayed. And each time he comes, he grows more terrible. Legends tell of him walking upon worlds where the soil itself turns to skulls, of rivers reversing their flow, running uphill to form great crimson fountains in his honor, of suns darkening, as if ashamed to shine upon his deeds. Even his own sons fear him, for when Angron manifests, the World Eaters lose what little cohesion remains. They are drawn into his orbit, like moths to fire, their nails screaming louder, their frenzy magnified. Some warbands are consumed entirely, their warriors, burning out in orgies of slaughter until nothing remains but dust and echoes. Others scatter, unable to bear the weight of his presence, and yet they always return. Because to the World Eaters, Angron is not only their Primarch, he is their curse made flesh. He is the nails. He is the rage. He is the proof that there is no escape. The Imperium has learned to dread his name more than any other daemon Primarch. Fulgrim corrupts, Mortarion rots. Magnus deceives, Perturabo besieges. But Angron, he annihilates. he leaves behind nothing. When imperial generals speak his name, they whisper it. When the Inquisition writes it, they blacken it with seals of secrecy. And among the common folk, his name is never spoken at all. He is simply known as the Red Angel, the shadow that falls upon a world before its end. And so the galaxy endures his coming, again and again, never knowing where the next storm will break, never knowing which world will vanish beneath his shadow, but always knowing the outcome. Where Angron walks, civilizations perish. Where Angron roars, the stars themselves seem to tremble. Where Angron treads, among the no many horrors of the galaxy, few are as insidious as the butcher's nails. They are not a weapon forged of steel, nor a daemon born of the warp. They are a device, crude and cruel, buried deep in the flesh of the brain. Yet their touch is far worse than any blade, for they devour the very soul of the bearer. It was upon Nuceria, Angron's world of bondage, that the nails were first driven into his skull. A punishment, a leash, a torment disguised as strength. The slavers of Nuceria sought to break their gladiator lord, to make him more obedient, more vicious. What they created instead was a monster that would one day shatter worlds. The nails did not vanish when Angron was taken into the embrace of Khorne. They did not burn away in his ascension. Instead, their curse spread, replicated by the hands of the Legion's own techno-sorcerers, forced into the skulls of his sons. The World Eaters became a brotherhood not of loyalty, but of shared agony. Every warrior who bore the nails lived in constant torment, every heartbeat a pulse of pain that could only be silenced by slaughter. To live as a World Eater is to live with the nails. They gnaw at thought, they strip away memory, they grind down the capacity for anything but violence. A World Eater can no longer dream of peace, nor love, nor even ambition. Only rage remains. The Inquisition has long studied the phenomenon, captured berserkers, restrained in chains thicker than a man's torso, howl day and night until death. Dissection reveals the nails fused into brain tissue, pulsing with alien energy. Even when the device is removed, the victim dies screaming, their mind too hollow to survive without the endless chorus of rage. The curse is total. The curse is eternal. It is whispered that some World Eaters resisted implantation, that they begged to be spared. Those who refused were cut down by their own brothers. Branded cowards, unworthy of Angron's blood. Thus, within the 12th, the nails are not merely a curse, they are identity. To be a World Eater is to carry them. To lack them is to be nothing. And so the cycle feeds itself. The nails howl, demanding release. The warrior slaughters, silencing the pain for a moment. When the blood dries, the pain returns, louder, sharper, more unbearable. There is no end but death. And even death brings no mercy. For the souls of the World Eaters are dragged screaming into Khorne's domain, bound to fight forever in the Blood God's endless arenas. This curse has hollowed them. Where once the 12th Legion were warriors, proud and terrible, now they are but beasts. Where once they might have built empires in their father's name, they now leave only ashes. The nails rob them of reason, of memory, of purpose. All that is left is the kill. Some whisper that Angron himself weeps in rare moments of clarity. Though none can say if this is truth or lie. If he does, Those tears are unseen, drowned forever in the sea of rage that defines him. For if there is one truth the nails have proven, it is this: there is no redemption for the World Eaters, no cure, no path back to what they once were. The other traitor legions cling to fragments of their past. The Death Guard still honor their Primarch as father. The Word-bearers still worship their scriptures. Even the Black Legion clings to the dream of dominion. But the World Eaters have nothing but the nails. They are chained to fury. They are prisoners of their own blood. And this prison has lasted 10,000 years. It will last 10,000 more, until the galaxy itself is drowned in blood, or until the stars burn out. This is the curse of the Butcher's nails. Not merely the torment of pain, but the death of memory, the erasure of humanity, the eternal slavery to Khorne's hunger. And so, when the galaxy speaks of the World Eaters, it does not speak of warriors. It speaks of beasts, bound in red armor, howling as the nails beat their rhythm of death. Beasts who will never know rest. Beasts who will never know peace. 10,000 years is a span beyond mortal reckoning. Empires have risen and fallen in less time. Civilizations have flourished, reached for the stars, and crumbled into dust within a fraction of that span. Yet the World Eaters endure, not as rulers, not as builders, not even as conquerors. They endure as destroyers, eternal, insatiable, unrelenting. Their name has become a curse whispered in every corner of the Imperium. Their warbands are not counted in numbers, for numbers mean nothing when reason is dead. They are instead remembered by the scars they leave upon the galaxy. A shrine world reduced to silence, its sacred spires toppled and stained with gore. An agri-colony, left barren, its fields salted with the blood of its people. A forge world, strict not for conquest, but simply torn apart, its machines fed to the flames, for no reason save the joy of annihilation. This is the pattern of their existence. Where others fight to rule, the World Eaters fight to erase. Their legacy is not written in banners or monuments, but in absence, in the hollow void where once a world had been. The Imperium fears them. The Inquisition hunts them. Even other traitor legions view them with disdain, calling them mad dogs, unworthy of strategy or empire. And yet, all give them space. For no warlord, not even Abaddon the Despoiler, has truly mastered the World Eaters. They follow only the call of blood, the rhythm of the nails, the roar of their father. No oath binds them, no chain restrains them. They are loyal only to slaughter. Across the millennia, countless legends have grown. Stories passed from voidship to voidship, whispered by refugees who fled burning skies. Superstition turned to certainty, certainty into prophecy. It is said that when the World Eaters are sighted, the Emperor's tarot bleeds crimson. It is said that their axes drink so deeply that entire rivers run red for centuries after their passing. It is said that the very warp grows swollen with power in their wake, as if reality itself recoils from their hunger. And among mortals, one phrase is remembered above all: where the World Eaters tread, no world survives. It is not merely a saying, it is a law, as immutable as gravity, as final as death. A world that feels the thunder of their drop pods is already a corpse. A civilization that hears their war cry is already erased. Even in the warp, among daemons and horrors without number, They are feared, for they are not cunning. They are not subtle. They are fury incarnate, a tide of red that drowns all. And still, they are endless. For every warband that burns itself out in madness, another rises from the ashes. For every champion who falls in a frenzy of bloodletting, another claws his way into daemonhood, eager to carve his name in slaughter. The cycle continues, without beginning, without end. This is their immortality, not the immortality of glory, not the immortality of empire, but the immortality of terror. The immortality of a nightmare that cannot be forgotten. In the end, this is the true fate of the World Eaters: to rage forever, to kill forever, to vanish into myth, only to return again, like a wound that never heals. Their legacy is not a dynasty nor a dominion. Their legacy is extinction. And when the galaxy itself lies in ruins, when stars grow cold and empires burn away, perhaps the last sound that will echo in the void will be the roar of Angron and the rhythm of the nails demanding slaughter. Still, for where the World Eaters tread, no world survives. The galaxy trembles, yet time has passed as if it fears to count the years. 10,000 centuries have bled into the void, and still the World Eaters endure. They do not rule, they do not build, they do not seek glory. They exist only to rend, to slaughter, to erase. And at their head walks the Red Angel, Angron, Daemon Primarch, the embodiment of rage unbound, the hammer of Khorne's will. He is not a conqueror. He is not a warlord. He is the shadow that follows death itself. When he emerges from the warp, stars recoil, suns weep, and the cries of billions become a symphony for his fury. No fortress can hold him. No army can halt him. No prayer can sway him. He is eternal. He is inexhaustible. The warbands of the World Eaters follow him, yet even they are mere fuel for his wrath. Brothers turn to ashes beneath his gaze. The nails scream with renewed intensity, driving every warrior to madness beyond reason. Every world that feels the tread of his boots is already doomed. Every life that hears his roar is already claimed. Legends speak of him in hushed tones. Scribes mark his path as prophecy. The Imperium trembles at the whisper of his name. And yet there is no end. For Angron does not die. He cannot die. He is rage incarnate, the living proof that the galaxy itself is a battlefield, and all are prey. The Red Angel's shadow stretches across the stars. Wherever he falls, civilizations crumble. Wherever he strikes, history ends. And even if the Imperium rises, even if heroes gather, even if the galaxy lights 1,000 fires of resistance, they will only delay the inevitable. For one day, when the tides of war consume all, when the stars themselves grow cold, the first sound of the galaxy's undoing will be the roar of Angron. And when he comes, where the World Eaters tread, no world survives.